Lyra Moonwhisper sat alone in the deepest chamber of the old library where dust covered everything, and the air smelled of forgotten books and ancient stone. Her fingers traced the edge of a crumbling manuscript that should not exist according to everything she had been taught. The text spoke of beings called humans, who built the stargates that connected thousands of worlds across the galaxy. But every scholar in Ethermore insisted humans were nothing more than myths and children's tales to explain technology. Nobody understood anymore. Ember, the crimson dragon barely 50 years old and still considered young by dragon standards, lifted her massive head from where she rested in the corner, and smoke drifted from her nostrils as she sensed her bonded companion growing more troubled with each page. The dragon could feel Lyra's heartbeat quickening through their mental link, and her ancient instincts whispered warnings that something dangerous was being uncovered in these dusty texts. The elf woman read faster now, and her pale hands trembled slightly as the words painted a picture that terrified her. According to this prophecy, humans had not simply vanished into legend, but had left the galaxy on purpose after fighting some great enemy, and they would return when the great devourer awakens from the void between stars. Lyra wanted to dismiss it as religious nonsense, but the technical details about the Stargate network matched perfectly with discoveries she had made during her decades of research. She stood abruptly and nearly knocked over the ancient oil lamp that provided the only light in this abandoned section, and Ember rose with her. The dragon's massive form barely fit in the chamber, but she had squeezed herself down here because she refused to let Lyra face the dark alone. They had been bonded since Lyra was a child, and Ember was barely hatched, and neither could imagine existing without the other now. For 3 weeks, Lyra brought her findings to the Council of Elders in the crystal spires above, and for 3 weeks they dismissed her concerns with polite smiles and condescending explanations about how young scholars often got carried away with romantic notions. Even when she showed them the mathematical proofs and the star charts that lined up perfectly with the prophecy, they patted her hand and suggested she focus on more practical research. Then the transmission came from the colony world called Brightshore, and it changed everything. The message was brief and filled with screaming and static, but in the background, Lyra heard sounds that did not belong in any known language, and saw geometric symbols flash across the screen that hurt her eyes to look at directly. Then nothing but silence as Brightshore went dark and stopped responding to any communication. The council tried to claim it was technical failure or perhaps a solar flare, but Captain Maya Stone of the Border Patrol had been listening to Lyra's theories, and she saw the fear in the young scholar's eyes. Maya was a practical woman who had spent 40 years keeping the frontier safe, and she trusted her instincts about danger more than she trusted politicians who cared more about keeping people calm than keeping them safe. Maya offered Lyra and Ember passage on her patrol ship to investigate Brightshore directly, and Lyra accepted before the council could forbid it. The journey through the stargates took 2 days, and with each jump through those massive rings of strange technology that humanity supposedly built, Lyra felt her certainty growing that everything she had discovered was real and terrible. When they emerged in Brightshore's system, the sensors showed nothing at first, and Maya's crew hoped they would find some reasonable explanation, but as they approached the colony world itself, the silence on the bridge grew heavy with dread. The planet below had been stripped of all life, and its cities were reduced to fine dust that swirled in dead winds across a barren surface. Ember pressed against the viewing port, and her scales reflected the dim light from Brightshore's dying sun. She could feel something wrong with this place on a level that went beyond normal senses. Dragons carried memories passed down through generations, and somewhere deep in her inherited knowledge, something recognized the geometric patterns carved into the planet's crust. Below, Maya sent down scanning drones, and what they found made even her veteran crew go pale. Every living thing on Brightshore had been consumed down to the bacterial level, and the ground itself had been drained of certain elements in a pattern that suggested intelligence and purpose behind the destruction. This was not natural disaster or weapon malfunction, but something that had fed on an entire world. In orbit, they discovered the derelict ship, and at first nobody recognized what they were looking at. Because the design was unlike anything in current use, it drifted without power, and its hull was scarred by weapons fire from a battle fought so long ago that the metal had become brittle with age. But when Maya's technical officer managed to access what remained of the ship's computer system, the language that appeared on screen made Lyra cry out in shock. The text was identical to the ancient manuscripts she had been studying, and the ship's AI core, barely functional after thousands of years in the void, managed to deliver one message before its power failed completely. The synthetic voice spoke in perfect ancient human standard and said, "They are coming back, and we could not stop them alone last time, and you will need us." Then the core died with a sound like a sigh and left them in silence. Lyra stood on the bridge with Ember's massive head resting on her shoulder for comfort, and she knew with absolute certainty that the prophecy was coming true. Somewhere out in the dark between stars, something ancient and hungry was waking up, and the elder races had no idea how to fight it because they had spent 3,000 years forgetting that humans were real and dismissing the defensive technology they lived among as mysterious gifts. From unknown benefactors, Maya immediately sent an emergency transmission back through the stargates to the Council and demanded they take action. But Lyra knew from the captain's expression that she expected more delays and more denial. Politicians did not want to believe in threats they could not control, and admitting that humans were real meant admitting that everything the elder races thought they knew about their own history was wrong. Ember rumbled deep in her chest, and the sound carried through the ship's hull. She was remembering things now, and fragments of ancient dragon memories surfacing about massive fleets and warriors in powered armor and weapons that could crack worlds. The dreams had seemed like fantasy before, but now she understood they were history, and the humans her ancestors had known were not the gentle builders of legend, but soldiers who had fought something so terrible they had been willing to leave the galaxy itself to keep it contained. As Maya's ship jumped back toward civilization, Lyra returned to translating the texts with new urgency, and Ember lay beside her and shared what memories she could access from the deep knowledge all dragons carried. Together they began to understand the scope of what was coming and why the prophecy had been so specific about humanity's return. The elder races were about to learn that some legends existed for a reason, and that forgetting the past did not erase it, but only made them unprepared when it came back to find them. 3 more colony worlds would fall before the Council finally listened, and by then it would almost be too late. 3 more worlds went silent within the next month, and each time the pattern was the same. Cities turned to dust and all life consumed down to nothing, and those terrible geometric symbols carved deep into planetary crust. The Galactic Council could no longer pretend this was isolated technical failure or natural disaster, because the evidence was overwhelming and terrifying. Lyra worked day and night translating the human archives with help from fragments of the dead AI they had recovered from the derelict ship, and what she learned made her wish she had never started searching. Humans had not disappeared because they wanted to, but because they had fought a war against something called the Cascade, and won at such terrible cost that leaving the galaxy seemed like the only option. The Cascade was not from their dimension, but came from somewhere else entirely, and it existed only to consume and grow. It was a hive mind that fed on entire civilizations and used what it learned from each conquered species to become stronger and smarter. Humans had fought it for 200 years before finally managing to seal it away beyond dimensional barriers, and then they had gone into exile among the stars to watch and wait in case it ever returned. What made Lyra feel sick with guilt was learning the truth about the elder races themselves. They were not the ancient inheritors of the galaxy, but the primitive civilizations that humans had uplifted and protected before leaving. The stargates and defensive satellites and all the technology they had built their societies around were gifts from humanity to help them survive without human protection. The current elder races were the children humanity had raised and then left behind, and over 3,000 years, those children had grown arrogant and forgotten their parents and reduced them to myths and legends. Lyra realized her entire civilization was built on ungrateful forgetfulness, and now they would pay the price for their pride. Ember was changing, and her connection to the ancient dragon memories grew stronger each day. She experienced vivid dreams now of massive human fleets and warriors in armor that made them stronger than any normal being and weapons that tore reality itself. The dreams showed her the last war and how dragons had fought alongside humans as equals and friends until the final desperate days when dragonkind had abandoned the alliance out of fear. The guilt her species carried for that betrayal had been eating at dragons for 3,000 years, and it explained why their numbers had dwindled and their power had faded. Ember could feel the shame in every inherited memory, and she understood why dragons had isolated themselves from the other races. They could not bear to face what they had done. Lieutenant Kate Morgan, who served as second officer on Maya's ship, made a discovery that changed their understanding of the current situation. Some of the ancient defensive satellites in orbit around key worlds were receiving activation signals from deep space and bringing themselves online without any input from the elder races. Someone or something was preparing the human weapons grid for war. The question was whether those activation signals came from returning humans who wanted to help or from the cascade itself learning to use human technology against them. Kate could not tell from the limited data, but the implications terrified her, because if the cascade had learned to control human weapons, then the elder races had no chance at all. When a Cascade scout ship finally breached into normal space near the trade hub world of Crossroads, the true scope of their danger became impossible to deny. The elder races sent their entire regional battle fleet to intercept it, and Lyra watched the battle from Maya's ship with Ember pressed against her side. The Cascade vessel was a geometric nightmare that hurt to look at directly, and it moved in ways that violated normal physics. The Elder fleet hit it with everything they had and their weapons and magic and coordinated tactics that had won 100 wars against pirates and raiders, but nothing they did even scratched the Cascade ship's hull. Then the scout ship fired back, and in 7 seconds it annihilated the entire fleet. 300 ships and 50,000 trained soldiers simply ceased to exist as the Cascade weapon turned matter into energy and fed. On the result, Lyra watched species she had known her whole life die screaming, and there was nothing anyone could do to help them. The council finally broke, and panic spread across the network of elder worlds faster than news ever had before. Every race realized simultaneously that their weapons were useless, and their technology was insufficient, and their magic meant nothing to an enemy from beyond their dimension. They needed the builders, and they needed them desperately. Lyra had been preparing for this moment, and she accessed the human emergency beacon system that she had found described in the archives. The code was complex and required her to convince multiple ancient satellites that she had the authority to send it, but eventually she succeeded and broadcast the call into deep space. The beacon used faster-than-light communication methods that the elder races had never managed to duplicate, and it carried a simple message repeated in ancient human standard: "The Cascade has returned, and we cannot fight them alone, and please come back because we need you." For 3 days, nothing happened, and Lyra began to fear that no humans remained alive to answer, or that they had decided the elder races deserved their fate for forgetting. Ember tried to comfort her, but the dragon was also afraid because her ancestral memories showed her what the Cascade did to worlds that fell, and it was worse than simple death. Then every sensor array in Elder space detected the same thing simultaneously, and humanity answered the call. The human fleet emerged from faster-than-light travel at the edge of known space, and it numbered in the thousands, and each ship bristled with weapons that made the Elder races feel like children playing with toys. But these were not the gentle builders of legend or the wise ancients that religious texts described. These were soldiers who had spent 3,000 years hunting Cascade remnants in the dark spaces between galaxies, and every year of that war had made them harder and colder and more efficient at violence. Commander Lisa Hayes led the Vanguard fleet, and her personnel file said she had seen 200 years of combat through suspended animation and time dilation, and her eyes showed every day of it. She was not here to save the Elder races out of kindness, but because allowing the Cascade to establish itself in this galaxy would threaten human interests elsewhere. The Elder races did not know whether to feel relieved or terrified as the human fleet crossed into their space, and Lisa's first transmission was not reassuring. She listed their failures and tactical incompetence and demanded immediate military authority over all defensive operations, and her tone made it clear this was not a request. Some worlds welcomed the humans as saviors returned and built shrines and wept with joy, but others saw them as invaders come to conquer, and protests erupted across dozens of planets. The dragon clans emerged from isolation for the first time in millennia because they remembered enough to be wary because humans were capable of terrible things when they believed it necessary. Lyra found herself appointed as liaison between species because she was one of the few elders who understood human language and culture from her research, and Ember served as bridge between human technology and dragon magic. But the position put her in the middle of growing tensions as both sides distrusted each other. She met with Lisa aboard the human flagship, and the commander was exactly as cold and efficient as her reputation suggested. Lisa made it clear she respected Lyra's scholarship, but had no patience for elder politics or pride, and the defensive perimeter she planned would require sacrifices the Council would never willingly make. Colonel Amy Parker served as Lisa's second, and she carried an AI companion that was over 3,000 years old and had been one of the original architects of the Galactic Defense Network. Through Amy, the ancient AI expressed sadness at how little the Elder races had learned and how much they had forgotten. The humans immediately began their preparations and retrofitted Elder ships with proper weapons and trained their soldiers in tactics that actually worked against Cascade technology and reactivated defense platforms that had been dormant for millennia. But every order they gave felt like a rebuke, and every change they made highlighted how unprepared the Elder races had been. General Claire Bennett commanded human ground forces, and she did not hide her contempt for Elder military readiness. She had seen too many civilizations fall because they chose politics over preparation, and she refused to let it happen again, even if it meant forcing the Elder races to accept hard truths. The crisis came when Lisa ordered the evacuation of 12 worlds to create a proper defensive perimeter, and the Galactic Council refused because they would not abandon their people. Lisa did not argue, but simply used ancient human authority codes that still controlled the Stargate network and locked the Council out of their own systems. Millions of Elders found themselves forcibly relocated as human ships blockaded the gates and prevented anyone from returning to the condemned worlds, and the sense of betrayal spread like poison through Elder space. They had called for help, but this felt like conquest. Lyra stood between two peoples and understood both sides. The elves and dwarves and others who felt like children being punished by returning parents they had thought were myths, and the humans who were terrified refugees that had been fighting so long they had forgotten how to be anything else. Ember could sense what Lyra could not through her dragon instincts. The humans were not angry but afraid, and beneath their armor and authority they were people who had sacrificed everything to protect a galaxy that had forgotten them, and they did not know if they were strong enough to do it again. Then the Cascade main fleet arrived at the edge of elder space, and all the arguments became meaningless because survival was all that mattered anymore. The Cascade fleet numbered in the thousands when it emerged from the dimensional rift, and each ship was a geometric impossibility that made reality bend around it. Sensors across elder space screamed warnings as the enemy approached the fortified world of Iron Gate. Where Lisa had concentrated her defensive forces, Lyra stood on the bridge of the human flagship Valkyrie, with Ember coiled beside her, and watched the tactical displays show the incoming threat. Lieutenant Sophie Grant commanded the point defense systems, and her hands moved across controls with practiced efficiency that came from fighting this enemy for most of her life. The humans had transformed Iron Gate into a fortress during the 3 weeks since their arrival, and elder soldiers now fought alongside human troops in integrated units that General Bennett had trained personally. The change had been brutal, and many elders had washed out of training, but those who remained had learned that survival mattered more than pride. Captain Nina Brooks commanded one of those mixed units, and her combination of human tactics with elven telekinetic abilities had proven devastatingly effective in simulations. She stood ready on Iron Gate's surface with her team and waited for the Cascade landing forces that intelligence predicted would come. The battle began when the Cascade fleet entered weapons range and opened fire with energy beams that could disintegrate matter on contact. Human ships engaged them using weapons that tore holes in space itself and tactics that sacrificed smaller vessels to destroy enemy nodes. It was brutal efficiency that made elder observers sick, but it worked. Lyra had been given a task by Lisa that only she could perform because of her unique understanding of both human technology and elder magic. She worked to enhance the Valkyrie's shield systems by weaving elven defensive spells into the human energy barriers and creating a hybrid protection that neither side had seen before. The result surprised everyone when a cascade beam hit the enhanced shields and scattered harmlessly instead of punching through. Sophie immediately routed more power to the system and called for other human ships to copy the modification. Within minutes, the entire fleet was coordinating with elder mages to upgrade their defenses. Ember discovered something equally important when a Cascade fighter craft got too close, and she breathed dragon fire at it out of pure instinct. The dimensional creature inside the fighter screamed, and its ship destabilized, as her flames disrupted the exotic energy that powered Cascade technology. Human scientists monitoring the battle saw it happen and immediately began developing weapons based on dragonfire properties. On Iron Gate's surface, Nina and her mixed unit faced the nightmare of Cascade ground forces, and these were biological horrors that the hive mind had created from species it had consumed over countless dimensions. Some had too many limbs and others had none, and all of them existed only to kill and feed. The close-quarters battle inside the Stargate Control Center became desperate as Cascade creatures flooded through breached walls. Nina's human weapons tore through enemies, while her elven team members used telekinesis to redirect attacks and collapse corridors on advancing swarms. They fought room by room and paid for every meter in blood. General Bennett coordinated the ground defense from her command post and watched her soldiers prove that elder races could fight effectively when properly trained and equipped. The dwarven units used their natural ability to shape stone and metal to create instant fortifications, while elven snipers hit targets from impossible angles using magic to curve their shots. But the Cascade was learning and adapting faster than it had during the last war. 3,000 years of evolution in the dark had made it stronger and more intelligent. When it deployed a new type of vessel that could absorb elder magic and use it against them, the defensive line began to crack. Lisa watched her tactical display show friendly ships dying despite all their preparations, and she knew the battle was turning against them. The Cascade had brought more forces than intelligence had predicted, and they were coordinating in ways that suggested the hive mind had learned from previous encounters with humanity. The moment came when Lisa had to make the choice she had been dreading since arriving in elder space. Protocol Omega was humanity's final option, and it would destroy the entire Iron Gate sector, including the millions of civilians who had not finished evacuating, but it was the only way to stop the Cascade from taking the Stargates and gaining access to the entire galactic network. She gave the order to begin the countdown, and her bridge crew moved to comply with heavy hearts because they knew what it meant. Protocol Omega would deploy weapons that cracked reality itself, and nothing in the target zone would survive. Lyra felt the change in the ship's systems and demanded to know what was happening. When Lisa explained the protocol, Lyra's composure finally broke, and she begged for more time to evacuate the remaining civilians. Ember roared in defiance, and her fire scorched the walls of the bridge as she expressed her bonded companion's anguish. The human crew watched in tense silence as their commander faced the young elf scholar who had brought them here and the dragon who represented a species that had abandoned humanity once before. Lisa's expression never changed, but something in her eyes softened slightly. She gave them 6 hours to complete the evacuation, and after that she would activate Protocol Omega, regardless, because she understood what Lyra did not. If the Cascade took control of the Iron Gate gates, every world in the network would fall within weeks, and billions would die instead of millions. The evacuation became a race against 2 countdowns, the Protocol Omega timer and the Cascade forces pushing closer to the gate controls. Every ship that could carry civilians was pressed into service, and human soldiers died buying time for elder refugees to escape. Nina's unit held the gate control center for 3 hours past when they should have been overrun. She lost half her team in that time, but kept the gates operational so civilian ships could keep jumping to safety. When the Cascade finally breached her final position, she triggered the demolition charges that collapsed the entire complex on top of both sides. Sophie managed the impossible task of coordinating point defense for hundreds of civilian ships, while also fighting off Cascade fighters. She had not slept in 2 days, but her hands stayed steady on the controls because human military training had prepared her to function past the point where normal people would collapse. On the surface, General Bennett personally led a counterattack to recapture a civilian shelter that Cascade forces had surrounded. She fought alongside dwarf heavy troops and elf scouts, and together they cut through the enemy and pulled out 2,000 civilians who would have otherwise been left behind. Lyra worked beyond exhaustion to keep the shield modifications running, while also helping coordinate the evacuation. Ember flew combat missions despite never being trained for war and used her fire to clear paths for escaping ships. The bond between elf and dragon had never been stronger as they pushed themselves to save every life they could. With 1 hour left on the protocol, Omega Countdown, the last civilian ship, jumped through the gates to safety. Iron Gate was now a purely military battleground, and everyone remaining knew they were probably going to die when Lisa activated the Doomsday weapon. But something changed in that final hour, as humans and elders fought side by side with nothing left to prove and no more politics to navigate. They were simply soldiers defending their home against an enemy that wanted to devour everything they loved. Nina crawled from the rubble of the gate control center with only 3 members of her original team still alive, and all of them were injured. A human medic and an elf healer worked together to keep them breathing long enough to reach an evacuation shuttle. Sophie's shields finally failed as a cascade beam punched through and killed half her crew, but the surviving point defense officers kept firing manually even as their compartment vented atmosphere. Because the civilian ships needed cover to complete their jumps, Bennett's counterattack succeeded, but cost her 40% casualties, and she carried wounded soldiers to the shuttles herself because she refused to leave anyone behind. When a young elf private tried to give up his seat for her, she knocked him unconscious and threw him aboard because his life mattered more than her pride. The Cascade pushed forward, sensing victory, and began targeting the Valkyrie directly because destroying the flagship would break human coordination. Lisa diverted all power to weapons, and prepared to sell her ship as expensively as possible. Then Lyra found something in the human archives that changed everything. Buried in the oldest files was a reference to how humans had fought the Cascade before, and it mentioned an ally that the records barely acknowledged, a dragon empress named Starfire who had sacrificed herself to help seal the dimensional barriers. Lyra showed the information to Ember, and the young dragon's eyes went wide with recognition. The deep memory that all dragons shared contained the full truth that dragonkind had been hiding for 3,000 years. They had abandoned humanity when the war seemed lost, and Starfire had gone against her people's wishes to stay and fight. The guilt of that betrayal had haunted dragons ever since, and explained their decline and isolation. Ember understood in that moment that her species had been given a chance to redeem themselves, and she knew what she had to do. She connected to the deep memory and called out to all dragons across the galaxy. She shared what she had learned and asked them to honor Starfire's legacy by finishing what their ancestor had started. Her call carried the weight of truth and shame and desperate hope. Across hundreds of worlds, dragons emerged from isolation where they had hidden for millennia. Ancient worms who remembered the last war, and young hatchlings who only knew the legends. They all felt Ember's call, and they all answered. The first dragons arrived at Iron Gate within minutes of Ember's call, and they came through the stargates in numbers that shocked everyone who witnessed it. Ancient worms larger than battleships, and swift young dragons barely bigger than fighters and every size between. They numbered in the thousands, and they were angry. Lisa stared at her tactical display as it showed the incoming dragon swarm, and for the first time since arriving in Elder Space, her cold composure cracked. She had read the historical records and knew dragons had abandoned humanity during the last war, but she had never expected them to return. Now the dragons hit the Cascade fleet like a living storm, and their elemental fire tore through enemy shields that had resisted every human weapon. Ember had been right. That dragon flame disrupted the exotic dimensional energy the Cascade used, and when thousands of dragons unleashed their fury together, the effect was devastating. Ancient worms who had lived through the last war remembered the tactics that had worked before, and they coordinated their attacks to target Cascade command nodes. Younger dragons followed their lead and learned quickly how to fight an enemy their ancestors had faced. The sky above Iron Gate turned into a whirling battle of scales and fire against geometric nightmares. On the Valkyrie's bridge, Lyra watched through tears as her bonded companion led a wing of young dragons against a Cascade carrier vessel. Ember's crimson scales reflected the explosions around her as she breathed fire that melted through the enemy ship's hull. Other dragons followed her example, and together they tore the carrier apart from inside. Sophie coordinated point defense to support the dragons and protect them from Cascade fighter swarms. Human weapons and dragon fire working together proved far more effective than either alone. She found herself shouting encouragement to individual dragons as if they were her own pilots. The dragon assault bought the time that Lisa's forces desperately needed and allowed her to pull back the countdown on Protocol Omega. If the dragons could maintain their pressure, then maybe the Doomsday weapon would not be necessary after all. But the Cascade adapted because that was what it did best, and it deployed its final weapon early. Because the dragon intervention had forced its hand, a massive rift generator emerged from the largest Cascade vessel and began tearing holes in the barriers between dimensions. Reality screamed as the rift opened, and through it came reinforcements from the void. More Cascade ships and creatures and weapons poured through in numbers that made the original fleet seem small. The dragons had bought time, but not victory. Lisa restarted the Protocol Omega countdown because now she had no choice. If the rift stayed open, the Cascade would bring unlimited forces and the entire galaxy would fall. She gave the order for all ships to retreat through the stargates, while the weapon-charged General Bennett coordinated the withdrawal of ground forces, and every soldier fought desperate rearguard actions to cover their retreating comrades. Nina's battered unit held a landing zone so that wounded could evacuate, and she personally carried 3 injured elves to the last shuttle before jumping aboard as it lifted off. The dragons refused to retreat despite Lisa's orders, and they continued their assault on the Cascade forces because they were fighting for redemption and would not abandon humanity again. Ancient worms sacrificed themselves to destroy rift stabilizers, while younger dragons harried the reinforcements coming through Ember, felt the pull of the rift through her connection to dimensional energies, and something in her dragon instincts understood what needed to happen. She broke formation and flew toward the Valkyrie while broadcasting urgently to Lyra through their bond. Lyra met her on the hangar deck, and Ember's thoughts flooded into her mind faster than words could convey. The young dragon had realized something crucial from combining human technical data with dragon dimensional sense and elven magical theory. If they could merge all 3 forms of knowledge, they might be able to reverse the rift, and not just close it, but send the Cascade back to the void permanently. But it would require someone to fly into the rift itself with a hybrid device and anchor the reversal from inside the dimensional tear. The technical requirements were brutal, and whoever went would be torn apart by dimensional stress, unless they had natural resistance to exotic energies. Dragons had such resistance built into their biology, and Ember volunteered immediately because she was young enough to survive the strain. Lyra refused to let her go alone, because their bond gave Ember an anchor to normal reality, and without that anchor, the rift would consume her. Together, they could do what neither could do separately, but it meant both of them flying into the dimensional nightmare. Sophie helped them build the device in under an hour by pulling components from human weapon systems and elder magical artifacts. Amy's ancient AI provided the calculations and warned them that the dimensional stresses would leave permanent scars on anyone who survived. Lisa tried to order them to stop and use Protocol Omega instead, but Lyra pointed out that the Doomsday weapon would only delay the Cascade, while their plan could stop it permanently. After everything that had happened, Lisa owed the Elder races a chance to save themselves. General Bennett gave them a company of her best soldiers to provide cover during the approach to the rift. Nina volunteered to lead that company even though her wounds had not finished healing, because she had come to respect the young elf scholar who bridged 2 species. The combined human and elder fleet held formation around the Valkyrie as Lyra and Ember prepared for their flight. Dragons formed a protective corridor through the Cascade forces toward the rift. Their sacrifice would buy the time needed for the plan to work. Sophie synchronized the Valkyrie's weapons to support the approach, and she whispered a prayer to gods she did not believe in, because these 2 young fools were about to try something that should be impossible. Lyra climbed onto Ember's back and secured the hybrid device to the dragon's harness. She could feel her bonded companion's fear and determination through their link, and she sent back love and confidence, even though she was terrified. They launched from the hangar and immediately entered the storm of battle. Cascade fighters swarmed them, but the dragon corridor held, and human point defense cleared their path. Nina's company deployed from assault shuttles to take out rift stabilizers on the surface of the generator vessel. Ancient worms rammed Cascade ships to create openings, and young dragons used their speed to confuse enemy targeting. The sky filled with fire and death as dragonkind paid in blood for their 3,000 years of shame. Ember flew faster than she ever had before, and Lyra held tight while channeling elven magic through their bond to create shields against the dimensional radiation. They could see the rift clearly now, and it was vast and terrible and wrong in ways that made reality itself recoil. Inside the rift, the Cascade's true form waited, and it was worse than any nightmare, an infinite mass of consuming hunger that existed across dimensions and fed on entire universes. This fleet was just a tiny fraction of its true size, and the realization of how close they had come to total annihilation made Lyra's blood run cold. They dove into the rift, and dimensional stress hit them immediately. Lyra screamed as her body tried to exist in too many places at once, and Ember roared as the exotic energies burned through her natural resistances. But their bond held them together and gave them enough stability to function. The device activated and began pulling power from both the rift and from Ember's life force. It wove human technology and dragon magic and elven dimensional theory into a reversal pattern that the cascade could not counter because it had never encountered all three working together. The rift began to collapse inward, and the cascade forces inside started being pulled back toward the void. The hive mind realized what was happening and threw everything at Lyra and Ember to stop them. But the dragon corridor held even as dragons died by the hundreds. Lyra felt the device reaching critical mass, and she channeled every bit of magic she had left into stabilizing it, while Ember poured her fire into the reversal field. Together they created a moment of perfect synchronization between all three forms of energy. The explosion, when it came, was not just physical, but dimensional, and for one eternal instant, every human and elf and dwarf and dragon in the fleet saw a vision of what could be. Not separate species fighting alone, but all races standing together as true equals. The rift collapsed and sealed stronger than the barriers that had held for 3,000 years. The Cascade fleet was torn apart as the reversal pulled them back into the void, and the dimensional anchors that had allowed them to exist in normal space shattered. The generator vessel exploded and took the last of the Cascade forces with it. The battle was over and the galaxy was saved, but the cost had been terrible. Nina's company lost 60% casualties holding the rift stabilizers. Ancient worms who had lived for thousands of years died protecting the younger generation. Human ships were crippled and elder vessels were wrecked. Victory had come at a price measured in blood and sacrifice. Sophie scanned frantically for Lyra and Ember in the debris field where the rift had been. The sensors showed nothing at first, and her heart sank because she had come to care for the strange pair who had brought her people home. Then a faint life sign appeared, and a battered crimson dragon tumbled through space with an elf clinging to her back. Both were unconscious and marked by strange scars that shimmered with combined energies. But they were alive. The fleet erupted in cheers as rescue shuttles raced to recover them. Humans and elders celebrated together without the barriers of pride or suspicion, because they had won as one people. Lisa allowed herself a rare smile as she watched the rescue succeed. Bennett wiped tears from her eyes. Sophie laughed with relief. Nina collapsed in exhaustion. The war was over, and humanity had kept its promise to protect the galaxy. But more importantly, the elder races had proven themselves worthy of that protection. Lyra opened her eyes 3 weeks after the battle and found herself in a medical bay that combined human technology with elven healing magic. Ember was curled beside her bed, and the dragon's scales bore the same strange scars that marked Lyra's own body. Shimmering lines that flickered with energies from 3 different sources merged into one. The scars were permanent markers of where they had been and what they had done. Proof that they had touched the space between dimensions and survived. The human doctors said the marks were stable and would not harm them, but they would never completely fade. Commander Lisa Hayes stood by the window looking out at the orbital dock where human and elder ships were being repaired side by side. She turned when Lyra stirred, and her expression was softer than it had been during the war. The cold efficiency had not disappeared, but it was balanced now with something that looked almost like hope. Lisa explained that the war was truly over, and the Cascade would not return in their lifetimes, and possibly never, because the dimensional barriers had been reinforced by the willing sacrifice of all species working together. The hive mind was sealed away beyond reach, and the galaxy was safe. The humans had decided to stay instead of returning to exile, and Lisa seemed almost surprised by her own words, as if she had not expected to make that choice. But 3,000 years of wandering was enough, and it was time to come home to the galaxy their ancestors had protected. not as conquerors or distant guardians, but as partners and equals with the elder races. Commander Susan Cole had been appointed as the first human ambassador to the reformed Galactic Council, which now included representatives from humanity alongside the traditional elder species. On dozens of worlds, mixed academies were opening to teach human technology and elder magic together as complementary fields rather than separate disciplines. Lyra had been offered a position leading one such academy where human scholars would work with elven researchers to ensure nothing was forgotten again. The dragon clans had emerged fully from their isolation, and Ember was celebrated as a hero across dragon society. She had done what Starfire attempted and succeeded. Where her legendary ancestor had fallen, young dragons looked up to her now, and ancient worms bowed their heads. In respect, General Bennett oversaw the integration of mixed-species military units on a permanent basis, and she admitted with gruff fondness that her former students had exceeded her expectations. The dwarf-heavy infantry and elven scouts and human special forces worked together with an efficiency that made the old separate armies look clumsy. Captain Maya returned to active patrol duty, but now her ship carried a mixed crew, and her second officer, Kate, had married an elf engineer from one of the repair stations. Their wedding had been attended by humans and elders alike in a celebration that would have been impossible before the war. Nina had accepted promotion to major and commanded a training battalion that specialized in integrated tactics. Her mixed unit from the Battle of Iron Gate had become legendary, and recruits from every species competed for positions in her program. Sophie stayed aboard the Valkyrie as chief defensive officer, and she had adopted a young dragon named Spark as her unofficial companion. The dragon was too small to carry a rider, but she could fit in fighter cockpits, and her dimensional sense helped Sophie predict enemy movements during training exercises. Lieutenant Amy Parker and her ancient AI companion worked to fully restore the human defensive network and bring the elder races up to date on its operation. The AI expressed cautious optimism that this generation would not forget. Like the previous ones, had Lyra spent her recovery reading reports about the changes sweeping through the galaxy, and each one made her smile. The barriers between species were falling faster than anyone had predicted, and cooperation was becoming normal rather than exceptional. When she was finally cleared for release, Lyra returned to her library in Ethermoor. But it was transformed now. Human scholars worked at tables beside elven researchers, and dragon students studied human technical manuals, while humans learned elder magical theory. Captain Maya visited often with Kate, and they would spend hours discussing the translations of remaining human archives. There was so much knowledge to recover and share, and all three women felt privileged to be part of that work. Ember had grown during the recovery both physically and in confidence. She was still young by dragon standards, but her experience had matured her, and other dragons sought her counsel on matters involving humans. The bond between her and Lyra had strengthened through their shared ordeal, and neither could imagine existing without the other. The strange scars they both carried sometimes glowed faintly when they stood near human technology or elder magic, and scientists from both species studied the phenomenon with fascination. Lyra and Ember had become living bridges between the energy systems of different civilizations. On quiet evenings, Lyra would fly with Ember above the crystalline spires of Ethermoor and look down at the city that had changed so much. Human habitation modules had been integrated with elven architecture, and the result was beautiful in unexpected ways. They would talk about the future and what it might hold. Lyra wanted to establish a comprehensive archive that would preserve the true history of all species so that nothing would be forgotten again. Ember supported the idea and suggested including dragon oral traditions alongside written records. The galaxy had been given a second chance, and Lyra was determined not to waste it. She organized regular meetings between scholars from all species to coordinate research and ensure information flowed freely. Lisa visited the academy during its opening ceremony and gave a speech that surprised Lyra with its emotional honesty. The commander spoke about how humanity had left the galaxy believing they were alone and returned to find family waiting. Her voice cracked slightly when she mentioned the soldiers who had died to protect people they barely knew. General Bennett attended with a delegation of military officers from every species, and she presented Lyra and Ember with medals that had been created specifically to honor their sacrifice. The ceremony included representatives from the dragon clans who formally apologized for their ancestors' abandonment of humanity. The apology was accepted by human representatives who acknowledged that holding grudges for 3,000 years served no purpose. Both species had made mistakes and both had paid for them, and now it was time to move forward together. Susan Cole worked tirelessly to reform the Galactic Council into something that actually served all member species equally. The old system had been dominated by a few elder races, but the new council gave every civilization a voice, including smaller species who had never been represented before. Trade agreements were renegotiated to be more fair, defensive pacts were strengthened, research was shared freely. The changes happened faster than Lyra would have thought possible, but the war had taught everyone that cooperation was not just morally right, but necessary for survival. Dragonkind established new settlements near other species instead of isolating themselves, and the younger generation of dragons bonded with riders from multiple races. Ember encouraged this and often hosted gatherings where dragons and riders could meet. The human fleet maintained a defensive presence, but Lisa made it clear they were not occupiers, but partners in a shared defense network. Elder species contributed their own ships and crews, and the combined fleet was stronger than anything either side could have fielded alone. Nina's training program expanded to include officer candidates from over 30 different species, and her graduation ceremonies became major events attended by dignitaries from across the galaxy. She took pride in watching former enemies learn to trust each other through shared hardship. Sophie developed new defensive systems that combined human energy shields with elven protective magic and dragon dimensional resistance. Her innovations made ships 3 times more survivable, and she freely shared the designs with any species that wanted them. The automated defense network that had been built by humans thousands of years ago was now maintained by technicians from every species working together. Lyra visited one of the orbital platforms and found humans and elves and dwarves and dragons all contributing their expertise. She realized that this was what the original human builders had wanted, not a galaxy dependent on their protection, but one where all species stood together as equals. The vision had taken 3,000 years to achieve, but it was finally happening. Ember flew patrols with mixed wings of dragons and human fighters, and she enjoyed the camaraderie more than she had expected. The human pilots treated her as an equal and valued her dimensional sense, while she learned tactical coordination from them. Sometimes at night, when Lyra could not sleep, she would walk through the academy halls and listen to discussions between students from different species. They argued about theory and debated methods, but they learned from each other and built friendships across the old barriers. The galaxy was healing from centuries of division and suspicion. It would take generations to fully integrate. But the process had begun, and every day brought new examples of cooperation. Lyra stood with Ember on a platform overlooking the rebuilt Iron Gate and watched as a memorial was dedicated to all who had fallen in the battle. Human names were listed alongside elder names and dragon names without distinction, because they had all died defending their shared home. Lisa gave the dedication speech, and her words were carried across the Stargate network to every world in the Alliance. She spoke of sacrifice and courage and the price of freedom, and when she finished, every person listening knew that the old divisions were truly over. The future stretched ahead, full of possibility and challenge. There would be conflicts and disagreements because that was the nature of different species trying to coexist, but they would face those challenges together. Instead of apart, Lyra and Ember had helped bridge the gap between legend and reality, between past and future, between species that had forgotten each other. Their scars would always remind them of what they had endured, but also of what they had accomplished. The age of isolation had ended, and the age of unity had begun. Humans were no longer legends, but friends and family and partners in building something better than what had existed before. In the quiet moments, Lyra sometimes wondered what the original human builders would think if they could see what their sacrifice had achieved. She hoped they would be proud that their descendants had returned not as conquerors, but as the guardians. They had always been meant to be. Ember knew through their bond that Lyra worried about forgetting again, but the dragon was confident that this time would be different because too many people remembered the cost of ignorance. The story did not end with happily ever after because real life never did. It ended with a promise that all species made together. We stand united, or we fall divided, and never again would any of them face the dark alone. And across the galaxy, the automated defense network kept watch, maintained by hands and claws and magic and technology, all working together, ensuring that if threats ever came again, they would find not scattered kingdoms but a united civilization ready to defend itself. Lyra smiled as she watched the sun set over Ether Moor with Ember beside her, and she knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. All of them. Human and elf and dwarf and dragon and every other species that called this galaxy home. The legend of humanity's return would be told for generations, but it would not be a tale of gods or saviors. It would be a story about finding family in unexpected places and learning that working together made everyone stronger. That was the real lesson, and the one that mattered most.